Good morning, everybody. I don't know what time it is for you, but it's about 10 o'clock in the morning on March the 29th for me. And I'm going to finish up, I don't know if it'll all be in one section, but I'm going to time myself this time just to make sure that I'm not messing you guys up for too long. Anyway, I'm going to proceed with the Rise to World Power. What I've told you so far, of course, is that the United States was going to make a fairly vital transition in terms of its international relations, activities in the international world. It went from being extraordinarily isolationist in behavior, attitude, and policy, basically, and evolving towards, of course, becoming increasingly interventionist. This is the dichotomy I presented to you guys before. I wanted you to know that the process that will lead to this change from isolationism to interventionism is based upon structural developments in America, the fact the United States was becoming an economic superpower, paving the way for it to have the capacity to be a political superpower, which of course it would become in the 20th century. That allowed them to have the capacity to become a world power, of course. There had to be, though, the idea that they would become a world power, and that was born essentially of the rise of the foreign policy elite, William Seward and friends, who began to simply think that this is a good idea. The United States become increasingly involved internationally, of course, and Seward would pass on his notions to people like William McKinley, Teddy Roosevelt, and ultimately Woodrow Wilson. Anyway, there's also just this general global dynamic of imperialism. The Europeans are taking over much of the world at this time, of course, and that began to be a motivating factor for the Americans to become involved in a similar kind of way. Now, in the American situation, one of the things that's just interesting to me is that on their own, left in a vacuum, it's hard to imagine how the United States actually would become increasingly involved around with the rest of the world. But events conspire, things that happen external to the United States that begin to draw the Americans out. And the first thing that's going to happen, as I told you, was the Spanish-American War. The results are the Americans are victorious in this war. They gain a small overseas empire reaching all the way to the Philippines. It allows them to be active in Asia. Not all those actions are tremendously pretty, of course. The Filipino insurrection, just a really ugly manifestation of American imperialism. But the United States also at this time, as a result of the Spanish-American War, establishes a general hegemony over the Western Hemispheric area, and they do that through the policy statements, of course, of the Platt Amendment and ultimately the Roosevelt Corollary. Well, the thing that will draw them out even further into the larger global situation is World War I. World War I is going to come along, of course, and again, an external event relative to the United States of America, and yet, it will ultimately draw them in, of course, and get them to step even further into the general activities of the entire world. So today, in this session, what I want to do, of course, is tell you about World War I as it is this major step for the United States moving forward to become a global power. So here we go, World War I, 1914 to 1918. Now I'm going to start this presentation with a song for you guys. And the song essentially it's a song about World War I. The song was written by Sting. I don't know if you guys know Sting. But in the 1980s he did an album called The Dream of the Blue Turtle. And one thing I've always thought was fascinating about that album was that it had two kind of historically relevant songs. It's not absolutely routine for a popular artist to use history as a foundation for the songs that they might sing. But in this case, Sting does not just once but twice on this album. There's a song called Russians, which was about the Cold War, basically. I'll never forget the refrain from that song. It says, it's all about nuclear warfare. We share the same biology regardless of ideology. And the song pleads that he hopes the Russians love their children too, because if we love our children, of course, we will never go to the point of mutually assured destruction with nuclear weapons. At least that is the hope of that song. The other song that he included on this album was called the Childrens Crusade. And Sting is British, of course, and this was his particular perspective on World War I. And it just has images that I think are kind of really, they're powerful, and I'm going to use it as a foundation for me telling you about World War I. So, and this is really from the British point of view, but it gives us the imagery of World War I. So here we go with the Children's Crusade. Young men as soldiers, 1914, marching through countries They'd never seen virgins with rifles, a game of charades, all for a children's crusade. Pawns in the game are not victims of chance, strewn o'er the fields of Belgium and France. Poppies for young men, such bitter trade, all of those young lives betrayed, all for a children's crusade. The children of England would never be slaves. Now they're trapped on the wire and dying in waves. The flower of England face down in the mud and stained with the blood of a whole generation. Corpulent generals safe behind lines, history's lessons drown in red wine. Poppies for young men, such bitter trade, all of those young lives betrayed, all for a children's crusade. The children of England would never be slaves. Now they're trapped on the wire and dying in waves. The flower of England face down in the mud and stained with the blood of a whole generation. Midnight in Soho, 1984, fixing in doorways, opium slaves, poppies for young men, death's bitter trade, all of those young lives betrayed, all for a children's crusade. Children's Crusade. And sorry about all of my little mistakes. It's just part of the way I play the guitar, what can I say? Anyway, this song has a whole bunch of notions in it that I really want to kind of use to introduce World War I to you. World War I, in terms of its point of its origins, is just, it's got to be the stupidest war kind of in the history of the entire world. There is really no good reason for this war. The Europeans will go to war in 1914, and we think that one of the issues that was going on is they hadn't had a generalized war for over 100 years. You have to go all the way back to the Napoleonic period. And it seems like they'd almost forgotten what war is and just the horrors of war, essentially. And, you know, there were all these voices at that time that war was much macho and war was, you know, invigorating and war was this wonderful thing that you should be kind of involved in, just sort of not understanding sort of the horrors that they will put upon the entire world as this all began. But, you know, one of the things, I don't know if you guys have ever heard of the Children's Crusade, you know, that's not original to the notions of World War I. In fact, there was a Children's Crusade during the Crusading period, and it was just one of the most disastrous crusades ever. All these children and others thinking they were going to go to the Holy Land and they're going to liberate, of course, that land from the infidel, from the Islamic people. And it was just an incredible disaster. And of course, I think that's what Sting is playing upon here. But one thing about World War I was that as the people rushed off to war in 1914, there was this tremendous enthusiasm. It's just, you know, so horrible in hindsight to note the enthusiasm. Everyone is sort of happy that they're going off to war, and they're marching away to big parades, and everyone's applauding them. And the women are, you know, mothers are kissing their sons, and isn't this going to be wonderful? And the girlfriends are kissing their boyfriends, the wives, you know, like this is a wonderful, and putting flowers in their hair as they walk away, and the men are all marching off, you know, so kind of happily into this, and what they think is going to be this glorious manifestation, of course, you know. And all of the notions were, of course, that they're going to be done, like by Christmas. This would have been in August of 1914, and it's all going to be over by Christmas or something like that. Well, you know, it's not going to be over. Well, it'll be Christmas 4 years later, basically, when it finally is. And in the meantime, the world will experience the deadliest war in its history, essentially. World War I commenced the era kind of industrial warfare, and over 10 million people, men and others, will die in World War I, over 20 million wounded, and the kind of hideous wounds of modern industrial warfare, you know. This was the first time ever that they began to kind of reckon with just the impact of war. In World War I, emotional impacts upon individuals, it was called shell shock. And shell shock, of course, is what we would call post-traumatic stress syndrome. And they began to study it. Psychologists and others began to study it, and you can see some of the footage that they filmed these guys. The guy just shaking and he can't stop, or the guys under the bed, and just this extraordinary negative impact on the psychology of these individuals. But all the other wounds that were there. Of course, people losing legs, losing arms. The thing that I always think about is they're just all of these wounds to the face, people with their faces sort of blown away, their mouth blown away or whatever, and even though they recovered, they would just have this gaping maw. And one result of this was that you have the first significant movements towards plastic surgery as they tried to make that individual, presentable in public. If you went out in public with your face just as a whole, you scare everybody basically. And one of the first things they did, this is before they're actually going to do actual cosmetic surgery, was artists, came in to try to help these individuals, and they made masks. And it's kind of like a Phantom of the Opera thing, and they would make the mask as symmetrical and representative of the other side of the face as they could, so that the person could walk out in public with a mask on, the gaping maw, sort of underneath that essentially, so that they wouldn't be so horrifying to everybody else. But just the extraordinary carnage of this war is just kind of amazing. And it leads to one of the components of the refrain in Sting's song, "Poppies for Young Men." It's like a suggestion of an exchange going on that's right there. And so what happened was that there were so many deaths in World War I, 10 million, that it became a logistical nightmare. And the problem was you could not transport that many bodies. It would just become overwhelming. It would be the major task of the entire war, and they couldn't allow that to happen. So what they had to do, of course, was simply turn the battlefields into graveyards. They would simply bury the men where they were kind of in the field. And this has horrible kind of ultimate impacts that sometimes the war came back over that area where the people had been buried, and the bombs would hit and the bodies would kind of explode back out of the ground. But anyway, this is what they had to do. And of course, all along the Western Front, as far as World War I is concerned, are these huge mass graveyards. I once drove through that area on my way. I drove from Lille to Paris, and I went right through that area. And it was my goal to stop and to see some of these graveyards. But I got just so nervous about being able to find my way, I'd gotten lost the day before in Lille, and so I drove through it without doing it. It's one of the great regrets of my life, and if I ever get a chance, I will go back there. I will go to those graveyards. I will say my little prayer, and try to express myself in some kind of way. But anyway, there are these huge graveyards in this particular area. So during the war, the men are being killed. They're just simply buried there, kind of in the area of the front, basically. And then, the war was over, and for some strange reason, in the immediate aftermath of the war, there were these explosions of poppy flowers that came out all across the area where these men had been buried. And of course, we really don't know what would happen, and you could do a scientific explanation that the bombs had turned over the soil in a certain kind of way, or all the fighting had done that. It had exposed like a layer maybe where there had been a lot of just dormant seeds of poppies, and the poppies just exploded out, or maybe it was some miraculous thing. But Sting is playing upon this, that the poppies for young men is this extraordinary bitter trait that was taking place, as so many are going to die as far as World War I, so many dying and suffering as far as World War I is concerned. Another line that he has there is "Corpulent generals safe behind lines, history's lessons drown in red wine." So you have a picture of a bunch of fat generals drinking wine behind the lines, of course, while the mass of the men are getting massacred, basically. This was the world's first totally industrialized war. And it's just so many things that are going to be able to kill you at this time. So, first war ever where every single soldier had a rifle. In the good old days, which they're not so great necessarily either, people had smoothbore muskets. And smoothbore muskets took a long time to load, and they were not terribly accurate. And their muzzle velocity relatively low, the distance they could travel was relatively low, deadly at 100 yards, not so much so at 200, and probably worthless about 300 yards basically. But now everyone's got a rifle, and it's got a clip in it, and all you had to do is kind of do the action, and you could shoot off 10 shots, within as fast as you could move the lever back and forth, 10 shots you could do. And with the rifling, of course, you increase the muzzle velocity and you increase the accuracy. So everyone has a dead aim on the person that they're shooting at. And of course, you're going to increase. This is the first time ever everybody had a rifle. And indeed, of course, there's going to be a price to pay for that. Other manifestation of industrialization, long-range artillery, huge guns that they created for the Western Front that could shoot shells 20 plus miles, monster shells 20 plus miles. That became part of the apparatus of it. It was the first war with tanks, and the tanks were awkward and funky, but they were terrifying nonetheless. Can you imagine if you saw that thing coming at you, of course, if you're just a regular infantry soldier. There was the first significant use of airplanes, of course, and that evolution is intriguing. In the beginning, the airplanes were just for reconnaissance to kind of see, but they began to realize that they could do damage. And like the first bombers were just a guy dropping a bomb, by hand out of it. And of course, the airplanes began to fight each other. You have aerial combat that would begin to take place with the various, World War I aces beginning to appear. Anyway, the airplane became part of the equation. And then one of the most horrible manifestations of World War I was gas. Poisonous gases were used, and they were simply unleashed, of course, upon the front. I have to tell you, this much more played into the side of the Allies because the prevailing winds, essentially, are going, from the west to the east. So the wind, if you just throw the gas up there and just let it go, of course, it could come back right back in your face, essentially. But one of the tragic visions of World War I are all those that suffered from the damage done by gas. And if it was mustard gas or chlorine gas, among other things, it could blind them, of course, would damage their lungs and kill a lot of people too. But there's these images I have of all these men who've been gassed, and it's damaged their eyes, and so their eyes are covered, and they're standing in long queues, long lines trying to get help, and they've all got their hand on the shoulder of the guy in front of them because that's the only way they can tell exactly where they are. But the use of gas, just became a horrible manifestation of this war, the industrialized nature of this war. But the symbol of industrialization of warfare for World War I absolutely was the 50 caliber water-cooled machine gun. Two individuals that would fire this machine. One guy's doing the aiming, of course, and firing the trigger. The other guy's doing a lot of the feeding, of course, of the bullets through it and making sure that would continue on. They were the moral equivalent of 82 riflemen, so 82 people with rifles, two guys doing that. And you could position, of course, your machine guns across the front. And then, these two guys could just sit there, and if, as people began, and they would, here's what Sting is saying, history's lessons lost in red wine. They were using these mass frontal assaults, it's trench warfare, mass frontal assault, basically. And so, the guys would come, and they kept on thinking they could do this. You keep sending mass frontal assault through the no man's land, which is replete with barbed wire and mud and everything, and then other imagery that Sting is trying to give us, of course, the guy's getting hung up on the wire, basically. But it was almost impossible for a mass frontal assault to overcome machine guns that are just pouring, round, I don't know how many, 200 rounds a minute or something like that at them, and just spraying the field, of course, and just eliminating those. If you've ever seen some of the little news footage they have from World War I, you can see they have these images, just footage of these guys running out from the trench, and the camera's just stationary there in the trench, and you just kind of watch one after another, they're killed in this. And it makes me think sometimes of that movie, The War Horse, where, and it kind of shows this notion of the glory of war, that these cavalry charges are going to be a big deal. So these members of the English elite, of course, mounted on their steeds with their sabers pulled, make a mass frontal assault against the Germans. And in the end of it, I think you guys remember, there's only two things that are alive, and one of them is the war horse. The rest of them are just massacred. It's the way this would go. But anyway, Sting gives us powerful imagery of just a war that will go awry in a huge kind of way. Now, the war is critically important in terms of the history of the world. There's no doubt about that. It will impact all kinds of things, and cause all kinds of changes as far as not only America, but the world is concerned. We see a change in the map of Europe as you begin to see the political entities that had been there before just disappear. The Empire of Germany, the Empire of Russia, the Austro-Hungarian Empire, the Ottoman Empire, they're just going to be gone. And new countries are popping up like Czechoslovakia, Yugoslavia, Poland makes its reappearance. You see all of these kind of dramatic changes as far as the map is concerned. You see the end of empires. I already suggested that to you. These empires just sort of disappear in the vortex of the war, and ultimately also of the Russian Revolution. They're just going to disappear. But I think the big thing that's happened, one thing I do have to mention is a psychological change that took place. Before the war, the Europeans were remember I told you that was the progressive era and everything, in a sense of progress. That wasn't just Americans feeling that, but also, of course, Europeans and others. And there had been like statements of particular individuals. Herbert Spencer, who is known for his connections to social Darwinism, which I've already told you is a really bad thing, but he kind of saw it in a positive way of this evolution of civilization, and he made this proclamation that the Europeans had evolved to such a degree that they were beyond war. That's what he said, beyond war. Well, in the aftermath of World War I, the attitudes are so different, of course. Sigmund Freud says that human beings have a death wish and that they just try to destroy themselves. So a sense of the benign nature of humanity disappears in the vortex of this war. It just has a huge impact upon just so many. One thing, an image that I have in my head, of course, there are all these graveyards I told you about, and when they did the graveyards, they'd have memorials, and one thing about World War I memorials, routinely in Europe especially, is the tremendous sadness expressed by them. They're glorious, I suppose, in some way, but that's not. Almost everything is the downturned look and the sad kind of visage of those, because of the enormity of the loss or something like that. But there's this German graveyard in Belgium, I think it is in France, Belgium or France. And this is a primary area, of course, of the Western Front. And this woman was a German artist, German sculptor, was commissioned to make the sculptures for this, in her way to kind of honor the dead. And it just kind of shows you that I don't exactly know what's going on with the German government at that moment, but it kind of shows you they were willing to accept some really intriguing art to do this. But she made 2 statues that were to be placed at the end of the graves of the German soldiers. And one was of her husband, and her husband is simply down on his knees with his head lowered in grief, just totally beaten by the grief that he feels. And by the way, I should have told you, this woman, her son was killed, of course, on the Western Front. And then the other statue is a self-statue, a statue of the woman herself, and she is prostrate. She's on her knees, but her head is on the ground, just to show the enormity of the grief that she was feeling at that moment. So it just kind of shows us the psychic damage of this war. It hit so hard and was so destructive, of course, that it has this kind of huge and enduring impact upon really the 20th century. But here's the major thing I want you to know about World War I. It's like in 1914, the Europeans, who were sitting in this relative position of global hegemony, they were the dominant power of the world at that time in no uncertain terms. It's kind of like they took a gun to their own head, and they pulled the trigger. And what they did was they began to create the environment which would make them lose this position of relative hegemony. In world history, when I got to this point, I would call it the beginning of the terminal crisis of European hegemony. Terminal crisis. The Europeans are on their way down. It's World War I, the Russian Revolution, the rise of Stalinism, fascism, World War II. And World War II, of course, just devastates Europe, and the Europeans are no longer in any kind of position of relative hegemony. But anyway, what's happening in World War I, of course, is that the global dynamic of hegemony, or leadership and domination, is changing, essentially. And what happens is, you can almost see that power wafting away from the Europeans during World War I, and it's going to land someplace else. And I'm sure you can guess where I'm going to tell you where it's going to land. It's going to land primarily with the United States of America. One image of war that I really would like you to have in your head is that there are really no there are no winners in war, There's just relative losing. Everyone's going to lose. Even those who are victors are going to lose, and they lose in significant kind of ways, of course. So it's not about winning and losing. It's more about relative losing, Some lose in a very bad way. My stupid dog is barking right now. Some lose in a fairly significant way. Some of them will lose in something of a less way. That entity which lost the least and gained the most out of World War I was the United States of America. So when the war comes to an end, the Americans are sitting on the cusp of being the global hegemon. They're not quite there yet, but they're on the cusp of this. So World War I becomes a critical moment, of course, in terms of America's rise to world power, as it allows them that further step to begin to advance themselves towards being the global hegemon. Okay. So what I want to do today is to tell you about America's relationship to this war. And what I want you, first of all, what I want you to know is that when the war begins, and this is August of 1914, the Americans respond to this war exactly how they should, given everything I've told you up to this point. If you guys remember, of course, it's all about isolationism. Beware of foreign entanglements. Oh my God, was this a foreign entanglement? Like you can't believe it. And as the Europeans see and are horrified by the war that begins to develop, as far as the Europeans are concerned, it is their attitude, of course, that this is not their problem, this is not their business, and they should stay away from it as much as they possibly can. So in the moment of the beginning of World War I, the United States of America, passed by Congress and signed by Woodrow Wilson, will declare itself neutral. So there's a Declaration of Neutrality in 1914. And indeed, Woodrow Wilson came forward in a statement and he said, we must be neutral in thought and deed. We must think neutral. We must act neutral. So the primary notion was that the United States needed to stay out of World War I. But just under 3 years later, in April of 1917, the United States will enter the war. So clearly there's a story. There's a proclamation of neutrality, but things will happen, events will conspire that will bring the United States into war by April of 1917. So the story I want to tell you is, the story of U.S. entry into this war. And the story can be kind of simplified, not absolutely simplified to be honest with you. It's going to be a story of trade, it's going to be a story of loans, and it's going to be a story about subs. So these are the three kind of component parts that I want you to be aware of that will bring the United States into World War I. So the first thing I need to do is just suggest to you kind of the dynamics of neutrality. Neutrality is an internationally recognized status of individual countries. And one thing I find interesting about it is that, even in times you wouldn't think that would be recognized, it is. Adolf Hitler recognized the neutrality of Switzerland. And Hitler was an outlaw. I mean, why would he pay attention to any international law? And yet he did, in certain cases, pay attention to it. So, this is a status that is recognized. People often wonder, I think it is an interesting question, why would Hitler recognize the status of Switzerland's right in the middle of everything that's happening in World War II, and yet Switzerland probably it helped the Nazis in certain ways, of course, information, funneling funds, it helped others too, so maybe this is Hitler just simply recognizing that there's utility, recognizing Swiss neutrality, but generally speaking, this is an internationally recognized status. If you proclaim neutrality, those countries that are at war, those countries are described as belligerent countries, so they are the ones that are involved in the war, recognize your neutrality. So the United States proclaims neutrality, of course, and that will be recognized by the international community. Now, if you declare yourself neutral, there are certain rules that you have to abide by, and of course that makes sense. And rule number one is you can't get involved in the war. And of course that just that's what you want. So of course you're not getting involved in war. And there are certain things, of course, that you cannot do. You cannot openly aid a government of a neutral country, cannot openly or even covertly aid a belligerent country, a country at war. You cannot allow their ships to find safe harbor in your ports. You cannot assist them in the training of their military. You can not directly fund them in terms of their warring activities. So if you're neutral, you've got to stay out of the game, right? And that's what you're saying. We're not part of this war environment, so you stay out of that particular game. However, there are certain, like in everything, there are loopholes. And in neutrality, there are loopholes too. So while the government of the United States, as it was declared neutral, could not openly aid any belligerent country, any country involved in this particular war, private companies could trade with countries at war. So one thing that is this is possible under neutrality, is the activities of trade. And so what's going to happen is, as the war starts, the Americans are going to start to trade with the belligerent nations. Now, I always have these images of war in my head that I want to share with you guys. So one image of war is this giant mammon. So like a big idol or something like that. And for whatever dumb reason, the idol that I always think of is the idol of on Gilligan's Island. And it was just like this big stone thing. I don't know if it's a tiki or whatever, And big stone thing with a huge gaping mouth, and inside the mouth was fire. And so that's my image of war. It's a huge idol with a big gaping mouth, and inside that is fire. And what the idol wants, of course, is to be fed. And the primary thing that the idol wants to be fed in wartime are human beings. War is an equal opportunity killer. It's going to kill everybody. It's going to kill men. It's going to kill women. It's going to kill one side. It's going to kill the other side, essentially. So, during warfare, what you're doing is you're feeding human beings basically into the maw of this idol, essentially. But that idol doesn't just demand human beings, human blood. It demands everything, right? War is a tremendously demanding economic activity where you need all kinds of things to continue the war effort. And once you go to war, you can't really think about it. You just have to spend the money. You got to do it. You got to get that stuff. Have your soldiers equipped, all the things that they're going to need. So the war generated for the European countries, a monster economic demand. They needed all kinds of things. And it shouldn't surprise us that in this demand situation, they will look to the greatest, most productive economy in the entire world. And that economy, of course, was the economy of the United States of America. So almost immediately, as soon as the war starts, there begins to be a significant amount of trade with the private companies in America. And remember, you could argue that they're not directly aiding anyone, they're simply conducting economic exchanges, making trade with these particular countries, essentially. But almost immediately, the Americans begin to deeply engage in trade with these so-called belligerent countries, the countries that are at war as far as the Europeans are concerned. Now, the demand was massive. And for everything you could think of. They needed oil and gasoline. They needed coal. They needed vehicles, trucks. They needed cars, of course. They needed tires. They needed clothing. They needed food. They needed munitions. They needed everything, essentially. And the Americans simply, of course, had this monumental productive capacity, and they turned it on to begin to supply these European needs. And it does create this one really interesting phenomenon of World War I. At the very bottom right there, this is my writing, so you probably can't read it. I wanted you to know that the American economy began to venture to a position of what we call 100% of industrial capacity. Industrial capacity is the measurement of how much you're using your industrial facility. And you generally do not want to be at 100% because that means every single factory in America is running 24/7, 365 days a year. That's not necessarily the way it should be. Routinely, I think 75% of industrial capacity would be perceived as robust, essentially, as a very healthy situation. But 100%, I mean, this is, I think, unprecedented as far as the American economy was concerned. I always like the image that I have in my head is that what they did with the American economy was they had it floored. Now, I don't know if you guys know the whole concept of flooring it, but that comes from driving an automobile, where you're driving the car as fast as you can. You've got the accelerator on the floor. You floored that. We don't do that very much anymore. We seem to have a lot of room in our accelerators to floor it. I don't think I've ever floored one of my vehicles that I have nowadays. I will tell you that I did have a vehicle that I did have to floor routinely, but that was a VW microbus, and I'm picturing, flooring was not that fun. I'd be in like third gear going up a hill with it floored on the ground going 35 miles an hour, just hoping, of course, that it would keep going, of course, and maybe go a little bit faster if possible. But so this is one of those rare occasions where the American economy was floored, and I got to tell you, that's not necessarily good because they're not even involved in the war. And when they become involved in the war, of course, what do you do about that? You're already at 100% of industrial capacity, but of course the Americans simply learned to raise the ceiling on their industrial capacity, and they will begin to produce even more than they had before. Americans have a very, very strong economy. But one thing we see happening almost immediately as the war begins is the Americans become deeply engaged in trade. So they're trading. So this is their first kind of connection with the activities of World War I. Now, at some point, the European countries who were buying goods from Americans began to run out of money. They start to run out of money. So they began to turn a little bit different. They need to buy goods and services, that's true. But one thing they needed also, I guess that would come under the heading of services, they needed loans. They began to look to the Americans for loans. So you're not just buying, of course, materials that you would need, you're buying money. You're buying the money that you're going to need. Now, loaning money to belligerent countries is a much trickier situation. If you sell them goods, and those goods are taken and blown up, or it doesn't matter to you in any kind of way. But if you loan money to someone, of course, you're vested in the future, you're vested in the outcome. And so the whole question of loans came forward to the Americans, and I must at least tell you this, there was a political discussion. They couldn't just say, yes, this is the situation. Woodrow Wilson was terribly concerned with this. He realized that the second that you loan money to any country that's at war, you become vested in the outcome. So it matters to you whether or not that country wins or loses in that war. And he realized that would change the dynamic of Americans' relationship to the war. Now they would be more vested in the outcome. But Wilson was kind of stuck between a rock and a hard place. If he said no to the loans, then that meant the American economy could find itself in difficulty because the Europeans would be unable to buy this stuff. But if he says yes, of course, that means that the Americans will indeed become engaged and become invested kind of in the outcomes of the war. And of course, because he did not want to be known as a president who caused some kind of difficulty for the economy, you guys all know that that's always going to be a bad thing, Woodrow Wilson reluctantly agreed to allow private banks in the United States of America to extend loans to European countries so they could continue to buy goods primarily from the United States of America. So the Americans did extend loans to the Europeans, and because of that, of course, they did become increasingly invested in what was going on as far as the European war was concerned. Now, up until this moment, I have sort of assiduously not told you who the trade is going to or who the loans are going to. There were two sides in the World War I. I'm going to try to do this for you guys. This shows you how rinky-dink my operation is. So I think you can see the map there. Let me check it out real quickly. How do they do it? Okay, so there's blue-colored entities in terms of this map, and there's the whatever the color that is, kind of a pinkish thing, all right? So those that are in blue are the Allies. There were two sides to World War I. There were the Allies. The Allies were primarily Great Britain, France, Italy, and Russia. Serbia and others were part of this equation too. I can't see where the map is anymore because of the glare on the sun. So they were the Allies, and they were against the Central Powers, and the Central Powers were primarily Germany, the Empire of Austria-Hungary, and the Ottoman Empire, and they're in these sort of pink colors. So you have two sides to this. In the very beginning, just to let you guys know, there actually was trade with all participants. So this is in the very first moments of the war. But as the war continues to progress, almost all of the trade and ultimately all of the loans will go to the Allies. So this is not an even situation, okay? Not all belligerents are being treated equally in this situation. Most of the trade, almost all the trade, and all of the loans go to the Allies. And the question might be, why, of course. I do want you to know that as the war began, there were expressions of support for the Central Powers. There were a lot of Germans that had immigrated to America, or people that had immigrated from the Austro-Hungarian Empire. And we see in 1914 actual rallies of German Americans in support of the fatherland. There's a picture that I have in my head from an old World War I history book of all these women dressed in white walking down this major avenue in some big city, and they've got this big black banner that kind of crosses, and in the very middle they're holding up an iron cross, and clearly they are trying to indicate their support for the fatherland. So there were pro-German Americans who were very much for the Central Powers. But the larger constituency of Americans, and most importantly the administration of Woodrow Wilson, were clearly more pro-Allies and more specifically pro-British. Woodrow Wilson, his chief advisor, Colonel House, have often been described as Anglophiles. Anglophile is someone who loves the English. So the general attitude of America was more pro-British, pro-Allies, than it was pro-German. So one of the reasons that we see the trade and the loans going to the Allies is because of a just general American attitude. The other reason, though, was much more practical, and that was that Britannia ruled the waves. The British had the largest overseas navy. And if you wanted to get goods and services across the Atlantic Ocean, you're going to run up against the British Navy. And if they don't like you, don't like what you're doing, they're going to sink your butt. So it was just sort of pragmatic to go with the Allies because it was easier to get across the Atlantic, and try to be on the side of the Allies than it was to get across the Atlantic, than it would be if you were trying to support the Central Powers. So I think I'm going to take my break right now because I've done my 35 minutes, but I'll pick this up in just a little bit, okay? You guys can get a drink or do something.